We covered spinal cord. So we talked about action potentials. Now we finished here. This slide, number 31, is the first slide that we have not covered. So when we talked about the spinal cord, we had a bunch of spinal nerves coming off each side. This is just a diagram showing what those spinal nerves actually looks like. So we've taken one, we've chopped it, and now we're looking at the end of the nerve itself. And so this hopefully looks kind of familiar. Where have we seen a very similar looking structure? Where we had bundles of bundles.
The muscle.
Muscle, yes. If this was a black and white picture and it was not labeled, it would be very difficult to tell whether that was a nerve or a muscle. We actually have some of the same terms here, okay? And so instead of having a single muscle fiber or muscle cell as being the smallest thing here, we have an axon. So here is one axon, and it's got the myelin wrapped around it. Wrapped around that one axon is a membrane called the endoneurium. If we take a number of these axons and bundle them together, we get a fascicle. It's the same word we used for the muscle. Around that fascicle, we have the perineurium. If we take a number of these fascicles and we bundle them together, we get a nerve that's covered by the epineurium. Epi, peri, and endo are the same prefixes we use for the membranes in the muscle. Also in that nerve are blood vessels. So a nerve is a collection of axons with blood vessels in it. So remember that a nerve has blood vessels. It's not just neurons and axons, but there's also blood vessels in them. Okay, so now we talk about the reflexes, which are what question 9 was on. So if you were going to give me an example of a reflex, what would you tell me?
It was automatic.
It was automatic. What's an example? Your knee. When they take the little rubber triangle hammer, whatever thing is, and they whack you in the knee, and then you only hope that your leg kicks far enough that you kick the doctor, right? That is a reflex. That reflex has a very specific pattern that it follows. Reflexes always follow this same generic pattern. That pattern is called a reflex arc. We're going to start here, go someplace else, and then come back. And so the first part of the reflex arc is a sensory receptor. And so we have sensory receptors in our knee that are going to sense that we got hit there. It's going to sense something from the outside world interacting with us. From that receptor, a signal is going to go, and it's going to go through a sensory neuron. The signal is going to go from the receptor through the neuron to the integrating center. The integrating center is going to decide, what do I do with this signal that I just received? How do I need to respond to that? Once it makes this decision, it's going to send the signal through a motor neuron to an effector. In our leg, that effector is the muscles that make our leg kick. That could be a number of muscles, but remember, a gland can also be an effector. So, in this case, the integrating center can be either the brain or the spinal cord. When you tap yourself in the knee and your leg kicks, the integrating center in that case is actually your spinal cord. If I put my hand on a hot stove, that's another reflex. I yank my hand back before my brain even realizes I put my hand on a hot stove. That is the integrating center there is my spinal cord. Why do you think in those situations the integrating center is the spinal cord instead of the brain?
Spinal cord closer?
Say it again?
Spinal cord closer?
Spinal cord's closer. We're dealing with our limbs, so the spinal cord is closer. Why does that matter?
If it's too faster?
It's faster. Yeah. The purpose of a reflex is to respond quickly. And yes, it only takes a tiny amount of time to go from the spinal cord to the brain and back. But that tiny little fraction of time may be enough to save my hand from getting damaged so badly I can't heal. Or if I'm being chased, that may prevent me from getting eaten. Okay? Whatever is going to happen, as long as it's quick, that's what matters. And usually, these reflexes are not complex things. Yanking my hand back is not a complex thought process. I just do it. Okay? If something comes flying at me, I'm going to at least wince and tighten up before it hits me. Hopefully, I can step to the side and avoid it, but at least I'll do something. In that case, the integrating center is going to be my brain. Why do you think in that case it's my brain?
Because it hasn't hit you yet. Hasn't your body receiving the signal from the outside world?
How am I receiving the signal?
From your eyeballs.
With my eyeballs. We haven't learned this yet, but where do you think your eyeballs attach?
To your brain.
To my brain. They're not attached to my spinal cord. And so it has to go through my brain anyways, and so why not use the brain, which is a better at thinking than the spinal cord? So in that case, the integrating center is going to be my brain.
The sensory neuron, what did you say about that?
Sensory neuron carries the signal from the receptor to the integrating center.
Okay.
The motor neuron carries it from the integrating center to the effector. So next we talk about the brain. And unfortunately the brain is fairly complex. Well, I guess fortunately for us as humans, it is complex. Unfortunately for you as students, I'm past it. It's not unfortunate for me anymore. Unfortunate for you, it's complex to learn. Okay? So we take the brain and we're going to break it down into 4 main parts. We'll talk about each one. We have the brain stem, the diencephalon, the cerebrum, and the cerebellum. You've probably at least heard the terms cerebrum, cerebellum, and brainstem before. You may have never heard of the diencephalon. We'll learn about it. It's actually one of the most important parts of the brain. It's buried down in the center. The brainstem is basically the connector between the spinal cord and the cerebrum. What you're picturing in your mind when you picture a brain is the cerebrum. The spinal cord comes down the spine, but it needs to attach. That's the brainstem. The brainstem has some very important functions we'll learn, but they're not higher thought process functions. It's not like thinking and decision making and things like that. This brainstem is what people like to call the reptile brain. It keeps you alive and not much more than that. But we can't live without it. It does the most basic bodily functions. That brainstem is made up of 3 parts: medulla oblongata, pons, and the midbrain. Last week I told you that we would come back to medulla oblongata. We'll talk about the medulla oblongata multiple times because it is actually really important. I also told you that Colonel Sanders was wrong about what the medulla oblongata does. And I said that Mama was not necessarily right, but we have proven Colonel Sanders wrong. No one has proven Mama wrong. Okay? So, we'll talk about what each one does. Medulla oblongata actually controls the heart and your breathing. It has nothing to do with aggression. So, why, according to Mama, are alligators so ornery then? Yeah, so many teeth and no toothbrush. No one has proven that hypothesis wrong. Then there's the pons in midbrain. Nobody cares about them because they weren't in an Adam Sandler movie, right? So this is our brain. Does anybody not know at all what we're talking about?
Oh, I
Okay.
do.
Okay.
It's like the best movie.
Right. Okay.
I think Waterboy.
Waterboy. Okay. People students in Gainesville don't get it. They look at you like you're crazy.
I love that. It's so good.
So this is our brain. Well, not our brain, but a brain. This is the cerebrum. That's what you're picturing when you picture the brain. You're picturing the cerebrum. Back here, it looks like a little miniature baby brain growing off the back of your brain. That is the cerebellum. This is the brain stem here. The spinal cord will be coming off the bottom. And then this weird looking area in the center of the cerebrum is that diencephalon. We'll talk about each of these parts. That is what an actual brain looks like. Everything looks the same. There we have different colors, we have different textures, we have diagrams, we have all kinds of stuff. But if you actually go in, it all looks like mush.
Have you ever seen a real human brain?
Probably.
Yeah, so on the Northwest campus, they do cadaver dissections, which any Santa Fe student can take part in, whether you're taking A&P or not. They're not doing it this semester, but what they do is when they do it, they save some of the parts. And so when I taught this class last semester, when I came in the class, there was a bucket with a lid with a human brain and spinal cord in it. And so you could pick it up, you could touch it, you could work with it. So if you go into open lab, they may allow you to see it. I don't know if they would or not, but it is there. Alright. So the first thing we're going to talk about in our brain is cerebrospinal fluid. We briefly mentioned cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, when we talked about the spinal cord. We said that between a couple layers of the meninges, we had cerebrospinal fluid flowing. Its main function is to take waste out of the central nervous system and flush it. It's going to keep moving. It's kind of like the sewage system of the central nervous system. As these cells live, they're creating metabolic waste. As they break down sugars and things, they make toxins. We need to get that out of there. Cerebrospinal fluid is clear, colorless. It carries a lot of nutrients also. Most of the nutrients in our brain are going to come in through the blood. The red blood cells in our body exist to carry oxygen. If cerebrospinal fluid could carry oxygen, we wouldn't need red blood cells. We would just have cerebrospinal fluid in our entire body. It's going to carry some, but not nearly as much as we need. Cerebrospinal fluid is mostly to remove waste and toxins. It is what we'll talk about down here. It starts in the subarachnoid space around the brain, in the spinal cord, and it's also in some empty cavities in our brain called ventricles. There are 4 of them, 2 lateral ventricles, a 3rd ventricle, and a 4th ventricle, which I imagine, yeah, there's a figure coming up. The CSF is made by the choroid plexuses. It's a tough word to say, not as hard to spell though. Each choroid plexus is at the bottom part of each ventricle. So on the bottom, the floor of the ventricle is a choroid plexus. All CSF basically is blood that has gone through a fine mesh filter. CSF is pretty much just blood plasma. The choroid plexus is just the filter. We push blood through the filter. What comes out the other side is a clear, colorless liquid. It's mostly salt water. That's pretty much all it is. We've taken the cells out, we've taken most of the proteins out, things like that. Small molecules like salt and sugar, or glucose, can get through the filter, so we're left with basically just blood plasma. So I'm going to skip to this one and go back to the previous one. So these are the ventricles. These are buried inside of the brain. You cannot see them unless you cut the brain open. We said that there are two lateral ventricles. Lateral means to the side. And so there are two of them. There's one over here, one over here. The cerebrum is divided into two hemispheres. Just like the Earth has two hemispheres, our brain has two hemispheres. The left hemisphere, the right hemisphere. Remember, it's the patient's left, patient's right. And so in each one is a very, very large ventricle. That is open space. And in that open space is the cerebrospinal fluid. So we have two laterals. They can then connect to the third ventricle. So the two laterals are the first and second. We don't say that the first is the left or the first is the right. They're just kind of equals. But since there are two of them, the next one is the third. Then down here, at the base of the brain, we have the fourth ventricle. And then connecting the third and the fourth is a cerebral aqueduct. So here is the side view. We have two lateral ventricles, a third ventricle between them. The cerebral aqueduct then comes down to the fourth ventricle, which is down here by the brainstem and the cerebellum. So I want you to know the lateral ventricles, third ventricle, fourth ventricle, cerebral aqueduct. Things like the horns, don't worry about. And the apertures, that's extra. So coming back, we look at the choroid plexus. So again, there's a whole lot of information on here. We're not concerned about it. The choroid plexus is pointing to this area here. Those lateral ventricles are right in here. And so the choroid plexus is going to be that filter that when the blood comes in to the center of the brain, it's going to get pushed through the filter and end up in the ventricles, which are here. You can't see them. So then we have the brainstem, which we said we have the medulla oblongata, the midbrain, and the pons. Medulla oblongata. It's going to keep coming up, one, because I like saying it. Number two, because it is really important. It's actually really important. It has two major nuclei. Remember, a nucleus, in terms of the nervous system, is a bundle of cell bodies in the central nervous system. And so basically, if you have a bundle of cell bodies, that's going to be a location in the brain that's used for a specific purpose. So here we have two of them. We have the cardiovascular center, which is going to control your heart rate and your blood vessels. So we can control blood pressure by controlling how big our blood vessels are. So this is going to be controlled largely by the medulla oblongata. And then it's also the respiratory center. So it's going to control how fast we are breathing. And now if you were to tell me the two most important bodily functions, heart and breathing, are probably the two you're going to give me. And they're controlled by the medulla oblongata. We also have cranial nerves. Just like in our spinal cord, we had three.
Can you go back
So just like on the spinal cord, we had spinal nerves coming off. We have cranial nerves, which are nerves that come out of the base of our brain. Those are things that are going to be tied directly to our brain. Like our eyes when we're talking about the reflex. There's a cranial nerve that goes directly to your eye. Okay, it dead ends at the retina. The retina in the back of your eye, we'll learn, is actually the end of a cranial nerve. And so they come off here. You do not need to know which ones are which. Okay? You don't, did you have to know that before?
Yes,
Oh, no.
all of them.
No.
The brain, the spinal cord, or the nerve.
Okay.
The nerve? Oh, yeah.
So you don't need to know, well, you don't need to pick them out here. You're going to have to know what they do.
They're on the homework.
No, we have to do like a matching, like what Roman numeral each one was.
That you do have to do. But you don't have to pick them out on a picture.
Oh, okay, yeah.
No. Okay. So when we talk about the nervous system, which is not this week in lab, we have to do muscles this week. And so it's going to be a little while. But on the bottom of the brain model, you'll see these cranial nerves coming off. So, for example, this one is the olfactory nerve. That's going to your nose. Then you've got ones going to your eyes, and things controlling your head muscles and things like that. We'll come back to those. Okay? Also, in your brainstem is not only medulla oblongata, but also the midbrain. We said that the brainstem is essentially the connector between the spinal cord and the upper part of the brain. The midbrain is the part that actually connects the two. The midbrain is essentially the cap on the spinal cord. So it's going to connect the pons, which is the middle part of the spinal cord, of the brainstem, to the diencephalon, which is in the upper part of the brain. If I go back here, this is the midbrain. This is the diencephalon here. So the midbrain is what actually connects them together. But this is the spinal cord, so you can see there's no break. It just kind of turns into a little bit wider thing and then ends. So the midbrain is at the very, very tip top. The pons is this kind of bulge that sticks out. Then the medulla oblongata is where it starts to get a little thicker here. So the midbrain, again, has two main nuclei, or two main centers, places that are going to control specific things. Their first is the red nuclei. They're red because they get a lot of blood. It's going to control most of our muscle movements. Okay? It's going to make the actual muscle move. It's not going to be coordination. Coordination is making different things move together to make our actual body work and provide function. That's going to be a different part of the brain. The midbrain is just more or less going to send a signal saying fire or contract. The other nucleus in the brain is the substantia nigra. They're very large, substantia, and darkly pigmented. They're not red. They don't get nearly as much blood. And they're also related to muscle movement, but they're a little bit more in the coordination. People with Parkinson's disease tend to have a failure in the substantia nigra. So you can kind of think of the substantia nigra as the quality control of the midbrain. The red nuclei send the signal. The substantia nigra makes sure that we're not accidentally sending bad signals. So if the substantia nigra is gone, the red nuclei can send bad signals, which can cause things like tremors. I don't need you to get too much out of here, but you can see a red nucleus is red, substantia nigra is a darker color. Don't worry too much about that diagram. like we said, the midbrain is essentially the top. And so another function of the midbrain is going to be taking all of the information that's coming from the rest of my body, that's going into my spinal cord and coming up, is going to have to get disseminated into different parts of my cerebrum. And so some of it is going to get passed on to this bulb here that we'll learn about in a minute. And then that's going to send it out. But it can also send it out that way. The midbrain can send some signals to the back. It's like UPS. It's going to receive a package down here in the spinal cord, bring it all the way up to the brain, and it can either deliver it itself, or it can deliver it to the post office, which then delivers it. So, where it's delivering it to here is the diencephalon. Diencephalon has three main parts. There are more, but there are three main parts of the diencephalon. The thalamus and the hypothalamus, which you may have heard of before, and then also the pineal gland. The thalamus is this relay station. That brown bump is the thalamus. It's going to receive signals from the spinal cord and then determine where in the cerebrum to send it. If it's going in the middle or forward, it goes through the thalamus. If it's going backwards, it skips the thalamus and goes straight from the midbrain. The hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system. That's an important point. We'll talk more about the autonomic nervous system, so this doesn't seem like a big deal now, but it will be later today. So remember, the hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system. Then the pineal gland secretes melatonin. Have you ever heard of melatonin?
Yes.
In what situation?
Sleeping.
It makes you sleepy. So that biological clock that tells you when you're supposed to be sleepy, when you're supposed to be awake, is working through the pineal gland. We know at what time of day we're supposed to be sleeping. And so the pineal gland at that time of day secretes the hormone melatonin. In the morning, when we're not supposed to be sleepy, we stop secreting melatonin. But we can actually get around that system, and if we're not tired or we can't sleep, we can actually take melatonin as a pill. It's fairly common. You can just buy it at any drugstore, Walmart, whatever.
The gummies are the best.
The
Yeah,
gummies?
I take the gummies.
The gummies. But the gummies probably have sugar in them, and you're trying to go to sleep.
It makes me go back to sleep.
Yeah. Guess if it works, it works. So here is another picture of the diencephalon. This picture is a better representation of the diagrams and models that you're going to see. When you look at the diencephalon, here is the thalamus. You see that bump on there?
Yeah.
That is probably the only diagram of the diencephalon you will ever see that does not have a bump on it.
This one?
That one.
Okay.
So when you look at a picture of a brain, I use two landmarks to find myself in the diencephalon. I look for this big arch, which is called the corpus callosum, but I'm not requiring you to know that here. But look for the arch. That is the top of the diencephalon.
Okay.
That's very easy to find here. That big arch is easy for your eye to find. So that tells you the top of the diencephalon. And so all of this down here is the diencephalon. Then, in the diencephalon, look for the egg-shaped thing with the bump or the dot on it. That is the thalamus. Next, we have the hypothalamus.
What
Hy-
is that bump? Nothing?
Nothing important to us.
Okay.
Don't worry about it. Next, we have the hypothalamus. Hypo means low or under. Think of hypo, low temperature. So under the thalamus is the hypothalamus. It's just this kind of empty looking region here. It's not actually empty, but in a diagram it looks empty. Then the final piece is the pineal gland. The pineal gland sticks off the back of the diencephalon. In the front of the diencephalon, it's not even labeled here, but we have another gland, the pituitary gland in front. Pituitary gland is not part of the diencephalon. We'll talk about that in the endocrine system. But when you're looking at this brain, you're going to have to remember that the pineal gland is the one in the back. That is the pituitary. That is not what we're looking at. Pineal gland is much smaller, and it's in the back, just behind the thalamus. So find the corpus callosum, then find your bump, that's the thalamus, and the hypothalamus is just in front below it, pineal gland is just behind it. And you found the parts of the diencephalon. So then we have the cerebellum and the cerebrum. They make up the bulk of our brain. They are the largest parts of our brain. Like we said, the cerebellum has two hemispheres. They're called cerebellar hemispheres because they're hemispheres of the cerebellum. The cerebellum is for coordination. Remember, the cerebellum is this extra little brain coming off the back. So what we've done here, we've taken the entire brain, cut it in half. And so you're looking at the inside of that hemisphere. There was another mirror image piece that stuck out this way. And we've cut it off. The cerebellum is for coordination. That bullet point right there is a great exam question. The cerebrum has multiple parts. The cerebrum is this up here.
Where was the cerebellum?
Cerebellum is the extra little brain down here. Cerebrum is the uppermost part of the brain here. We have the cerebral cortex, which is the very outer part. Ignore the colors here. If you just kind of draw a line, and we go the outermost third or so, that is the cerebral cortex. The cortex is a term we'll use a number of times. We'll also talk about it in the kidney. The cortex is the outside. So the outside part of the brain is the cerebral cortex. That is gray in color. People talk about gray matter in their brain. Actually, only the outer part of the brain is gray matter. And so when people say the brain is gray, not pink like they draw it on cartoons, it's actually on the outside, but the outside is the only part you see. The inside is white matter, and so it is mostly a white in color. There's also some gray matter inside. The cerebrum gives us the higher thought processes. The difference between us and the reptile, who only more or less has that brainstem. What are some things that we can do that something like a reptile cannot? Right. Correct. There's higher language. Reptiles can make sounds. They can kind of understand the sounds that each other are making. They can't think. They're more reactionary. They have a whole bunch of reflex arcs, and that's about it. Okay? They don't have a good memory. I don't know if you can train a reptile to do much of anything, but you might be able to a little bit, but it's going to be a whole lot harder than to train me to do something. Because to train me to do something, if it's simple, you just tell me to do it. And I remember it. And I just do it the same way again. And so think of the cerebrum as being a lot of memory. You can teach a dog to do a lot. A dog can do a lot. But it takes a lot of repetition. and they can't do higher order things. The dog's not going to learn to write. If anybody can train their dog to write, I owe you a Coke. Okay?
I think I paid for paint.
Take
Yeah, I swear. Like, it was on the news or something, like, pig, they hit a paintbrush, and they could, like, paint all kinds of,
I've seen,
not like perfect stuff,
Yeah.
but
Yeah,
you could,
but-
like, tell what it was.
I've seen elephants do the same thing.
Or dolphin.
Yeah.
I seen a dolphin, but it wasn't. It was like
The more you learn about how some of these things, you realize our brains are not that much better than some of these other animals.
Yeah.
Kind of depressing. So the cerebral cortex, we said, is the uppermost part. And it is folded so that we can fit it all in. If you took that cerebral cortex and you stretched it out, it's going to be way too big. It's like taking the outside part of a big brain and just kind of crunching it up. It's going to fold in on itself. When you crunch it in, it folds. The folds, the part, well actually, let me just get a model of it. So when you make a fold, you make a bump and you also make a groove. So the bump part of a fold has a different name than the kind of valley part of the fold. Let's use this one. So you can see it's all wrinkly and folded, right? And so the bump part, the hill part of the fold, is called a gyrus. The plural is gyri. The shallow grooves between the gyri are called sulci. The singular is sulcus, with a US on the end. And the deep grooves are fissures. Okay? So if I had, let me get a whole brain. Here, between the two hemispheres is a very, very large, deep fold. Right? That is definitely different than these. That is a fissure. These are sulci. The longitudinal fissure is this. It's the one that breaks the cerebrum into the right and left hemispheres. So this is taken apart along the longitudinal fissure. The central sulcus is the sulcus that's more or less in the center front to back. It's this one here. I would never ask you to find the central sulcus on a model that was not color-coded like this. Okay? When it's color-coded, look for the middle and then find two colors that are very narrow and run right next to each other, and then there's going to be a sulcus between them. That is that central sulcus. The bumps, the ridges, in front and behind it have their own names. The one in front of the central sulcus is the pre-central gyrus. And so that is the red one here. Behind the central sulcus is the post-central gyrus, the blue one. So find the central sulcus, and then the one in front of it is the pre-central, the one behind it is the post-central. So that's what we were just talking about. Nothing new there. Let's take a break. We'll come back at 5 after on that clock. So about 9 minutes.
Yeah, I got this. Are you going? Yeah. hard to use. I posted it that first day and then I
Like,
posted
there's
it
the
Friday.
issue.
Trust me, I've seen the one exactly.
So it's fine.
You're
It's just
seeing
like,
it?
like,
I'm
I'm taking it.
Like, I
I
didn't want to say that, but
know.
yeah, like, seriously, I've been there so many times.
But then, you
It
know,
makes me
it's
sad.
fun. I love the people there. But the one thing, I wish I kind of do wish I could because right after I talked to my aunt, she said she was like,
But I'm using it very
and it's like the final of the right?
Struggle. Yeah, seriously, that was like unexpected.
Should've just kept with it. I kind of wish I would've kept it. I just thought I was back.
As long as I'm ever not working, I mean, homeschool, but like, I'll say everybody, I mean, I've definitely worked in nursing last time, but I just, like I said, like you're saying, I can't, I mean, look how about which ones I was doing, I've been doing this since I was 16, and like, it's so hard. I just want to focus right now on career, yes, and I want to get it. Because I want to try to do the freaking language program. Whenever, are you doing a little classes for him as well? Or do you have to leave? Are you doing it? So you
I don't want to, but
yeah, yeah. I managed to get all, this will be my last semester before I apply. So, because they don't require you to apply for radiology, like, they have like a lot of classes. You do, like, just, you know, your normal. No, some of them. Yeah. Even like a dental, hygiene, do what the dental?
it's CDC a lot.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So like this dude who she's having she passed away.
Oh, no.
He's a oncology nurse, little kid.
What happened?
Oh, that's like the first
Yeah. I was gonna say, I'm sure he was young. Oh, so it's just happening right now. Oh, that's awful. Yeah.
So don't
Yeah, for sure.
don't wake your back on it. Because what it is like, when I talked to her then I got she was like,
Oh, yeah.
so it's like, okay, yeah, when it goes up, yeah. And it's like, each person you put it on the ball, starts to get picked on. So like, there's these students that
Yeah.
so like, it's in
Oh,
yeah,
it's very
it's like
long.
the people.
Yeah, but in October, like, she thought she was gonna go, like, I thought she was gonna have a prenatal breakdown, like, no one. I mean, she didn't go to school for like 20-something years, and then just one day it kind of did what I did. She was like, you know, I'm gonna go back. And, I mean, it took her, I mean, bless her heart, it took her like 7 to 8 years to like do prerequisites because, yeah, like, she took her time, and she was taking care of me and my sister and everything, and you have to do it your own pace. Oh, for sure, yeah. And now, she's been a nurse for 5 years. 6 years now. Awesome. But she'll like so overworking and she works night shift and weekends. So yeah. I mean, it's just she just has really she's not that far away from home, so it's really just about it's just really tough. But just before she's not, she'll have the first time she'll have another history. She'll have one stuff out there. It's like okay, everything's like kind of girl. Get all the things and everything, which I'm not like, you know, but you know what I mean. They think it's a hotel with free drinks. Seriously, and my mom's like the maid, you know what I mean? Like, that's what they act like.
That's not what it was like. When it was like, hey, can everyone stop being on the drunk people into the emergency room? In Gainesville.
Seriously, which I worked in the room emergency room, I've been there for like 6 months, and I was doing patient visits. like scarred for
Yeah, I
life.
believe it.
Some of the things I saw, like, crazy.
Yeah, and it was pumping their constantly. We're at 99% capacity at all times. at our school. And they just keep building on more towers and more towers. So scary.
One thing about that one would actually have a serious issue to go in personally. I forget what it's called. But yeah.
I'll probably apply, that'll probably be the first thing I'll do if I apply it. Cause they like, need everybody, everything. Are you good with it?
I know, my talking to Stacy and my sister's from home.
That's really cool.
Oh,
Oh, she's like,
I was telling her about how it's
Yeah.
she's like, I'm moving on.
I was like, what?
Maybe.
She's like, you never go to hospital besides here. Yeah, it's not that, it's more I have to like actually apply and do the program.
Yeah.
And then get it done.
Yeah.
You have to do about the program. I'm in high school session.
Nice.
Like that's where we need to get
Right.
for sure. Get in the hospital. Yeah, a lot of
I'm not gonna do that. I forgot.
Right.
What do you say, C? Your brother.
Oh, cardiovascular.
Gotcha.
So what do you say? I guess I'm
That's fine.
the reason I like picked that one. That's cool.
This is weird. Dude, I like just like, I'm like the same thing.
I guess by the end of the day, yeah.
No, everything.
Just ask it. Just ask it. I'm not hating. I
No,
know.
girl.
Yeah, I knew you did. I did. I knew
I
it.
didn't really good.
Yes. Okay, I had to.
Not me.
I'm like somebody like, we do the same thing. Like, this is like the learn things that I'm actually because dude, I hate this, but I try to hide it. I'm like, I'm like way too young and like way too much. Way too much. But honestly, we coming from the family, you have to have the community that's what I heard. I'm serious.
I would literally be like,
So funny. I had to ask.
Look, so when we're looking at
we'll talk about
the cerebrum, there are different parts of it. We're not going to focus too much on what each part does right now, but I do want you to know the 4 lobes, okay? And these should be easy because they're in the same location with the same name as the skull bones. And so under the frontal bone is the frontal lobe. Up here, where are the parietal bones? And so that is the parietal lobe. In the back is the occipital lobe behind the occipital bone. And then on the side, we have the temporal lobe behind the temporal bones. Easy. As long as you know the bones. If you don't know the bones, you might get frontal, but other than that.
Parietal's here and then occipital's here.
Yep.
And temporal's here.
Yep. So you should know where those are. So then the cerebellum is kind of down below everything. So this talks about the general functions of the different parts of the brain. We are not going to go through that. That is not something I'm giving you saying memorize that. Okay? You need to know the functions that I put into the slides. If this helps you, great. Okay? But don't think I'm giving you extra stuff to learn by putting that in there. Let me come back to those cranial nerves. Remember, those were the ones coming off the bottom of the brain, going different places. These cranial nerves, because they are not inside of the brain, are considered part of the peripheral nervous system. There are 12 pairs of them, so 24 total. And each pair has both a name and a Roman numeral. These cranial nerves come from different parts of the brain and go in different directions. Most of them stay within the brain, not within the brain, within the head area. So a lot of them are going to be dealing with our special senses on our head, like we have one going to the nose. The cranial nerve 1 goes to the nose. We have one going to the eyes, the inner ear, the brainstem. There's one going down the spinal cord.
Is there gonna be a list of these in order?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And you're also not going to have to know the names and function of all of them. Okay. Some of them only have sensory neurons, and some of them only have motor neurons, but some of them have both. So a sensory one is only going to carry information from the outside in. What do you think would be an example of where a sensory-only cranial nerve would be?
Finger.
There would probably be more. That a cranial nerve that controlled something out here would probably have multiple, because you have to have touch and then also move your finger. So what's part of the body that only receives signal?
Eyeball.
Eyeball, yes. So there's going to be cranial nerves that help move the eye, but the one that actually senses the light does nothing but sense that light. So that would be an example of a sensory only one. Some of them are motor only, like the ones that move our eyeball. That is going to be motor only. And then there are some that we call mixed nerves that have both sensory and motor. So this few slides, there's 3 slides here, list all 12 pairs with the Roman numeral, the name, what they do. Okay? You do not need to memorize this whole table. What I want you to do is I want you to know that there are 12 pairs. I want you to know whether they are motor, sensory, or mixed. And I want you to specifically know what the vagus nerve does. So I want you to know that there are 12. Based off the numbering system, tell me whether it is motor, sensory, or mixed. But for number 10, X, you also need to know that it is the vagus nerve and that it comes down and controls a lot of our internal organs. Okay? A lot of the other ones stay up here. They control things in your head, in your neck.
Did you say that one does?
Vagus controls internal organs.
Can you go back to the back one more? The back one more?
That one?
So we need to know that the sensories are
1, 2, and 8. 1, 2, and 8 are sensory. 3, 4, 6, 11, and 12 are motor. 5, 7, and 9, and 10 are mixed.
okay.
And then I also want you to know that 10 is the vagus nerve and controls some of your internal organs. So the vagus nerve, we'll come back to that one again, but you might have some unknowing interaction with what happens when the vagus nerve malfunctions. One of the things it does is it controls your diaphragm.
You can't breathe.
Yeah. You ever heard of getting the wind knocked out of you?
Yeah.
That can happen. It's caused by a spasm of the diaphragm, which can happen if you get hit in the vagus nerve. And so that's basically, the diaphragm is what moves your lung and makes you breathe in and out. If it spasms and it just contracts and just stays there, you can't breathe. And if you've ever had that happen, it is a horrible, horrible feeling. The first time, after that you know what's happening and you know to just wait. The first time, it feels like you're gonna die. Yeah.
Just so I make sure, X11 is 12, right?
X1, well, yes.
Okay.
And then,
IX is 9.
IX is
Where
down.
IX is 9, but I don't even see it.
It's
There
down
it is, yeah. IX is 9.
I haven't done Roman numerals in a
Yeah,
while.
I hate Roman.
VII.
I said Roman noodles
Yeah.
earlier.
So the V, what is that?
V is 5.
And then VII is 7.
Yep,
What's IV?
4.
Okay.
If the I is before the V, that means one less.
I think it's in Roman.
So I is 1, V is 5, X is 10, 1 or 2. And then if it's after, you're out.
What I never understood is the Romans were a very advanced civilization. Why didn't they just come up with specific numbers like the Arabic system, like we use? Right? I don't
I mean,
understand.
that takes so long, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, but the Super Bowl is like a
Yeah.
sentence long, you know? Okay. So the vagus nerve, we said, controls diaphragm. It's also thought that that might be part of the problem in irritable bowel syndrome. It controls some of the contraction of your intestines. And so if you get a crossed signal up in the brain, that signal, which should go someplace else, can actually go to your intestines and cause digestive problems. So that's one reason why some people, if they get nervous or stressed, they have digestive problems. Because those signals are going all crazy up in their brain. They're supposed to be going someplace else, but they end up going down the vagus nerve. And they cause the digestive. Okay. That brings us to the autonomic nervous system. What part of the brain did I say controls the autonomic nervous system? The hypothalamus.
Oh.
The autonomic nervous system is the ANS. Okay? This is an important part of our brain. Autonomic nervous system plays a very large role in our day-to-day activities. So it's going to control smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and some glands. It is involuntary, meaning we cannot control consciously what the autonomic nervous system is doing. We can, in some situations, push it one way or the other, but we cannot actually directly make it do what we want it to do. So we're going to learn that it has two parts. One of them is like a stress response. And so, if we are able to calm ourselves down voluntarily, like meditation or yoga or whatever you need to do to calm down, you can turn down the autonomic nervous system. And so in that way we can indirectly control it, but we can't just immediately say, I want to turn this on or off. So it is involuntary. It's mostly hypothalamus. This also says brainstem, but the vast majority of the control is going to be coming from the hypothalamus, with the exception of the medulla oblongata, which is heart and breathing rate. That is the brainstem part. So there's two parts here. There's the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Most organs in our body are controlled by both. And so we say they have dual innervation. Innervation means the nerves go into it. And so we say innervated by the sympathetic nervous system, or is innervated by the parasympathetic division, or is dual innervated, meaning it has innervation from both. For the most part, these two systems are opposites. Remember we said it's like a devil on one shoulder, angel on the other, giving you opposite advice, telling you to do very different things. Usually they're telling you opposite things. Occasionally, they may actually cooperate with each other.
It's like when.
We'll see. We'll see. So, we have one that's usually going to stimulate an organ. For the most part, that is going to be the sympathetic division. There will be a specific example where that is not the case. For the most part, the parasympathetic division is going to calm things down. It's going to turn things off. And again, there will be that one example where they are actually flipped. So this is what the autonomic nervous system looks like and how it is functioning. Because it's located in the hypothalamus, in the center of my brain, and my brainstem, which is up here, in order to control things down here, it's going to have to go through the spinal cord. But remember, going down the spinal cord, we have the spinal nerves coming off the side. We didn't learn what they did, but a lot of those are going to be controlling things that are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. They're going to be the highways controlling those signals coming from the autonomic nervous system. So this is an example of the somatic nervous system. Not the autonomic, the somatic nervous system. So here we have a spinal nerve coming out of the spinal cord. It goes all the way down and connects to the effector, which in this case is a skeletal muscle. So there is one neuron, one nerve, that goes all the way from here to the effector. The autonomic nervous system does not work with one. It always has two. So here we have spinal cord. Here we have the effector. Here they're organs. They're not muscles, they're organs and glands. So we have one neuron coming from the spinal cord to here, and then another one coming from here to here. And so there's two. There is always two in the autonomic nervous system. Where they meet is a ganglion. And so, in the autonomic nervous system, we have pre-ganglionic neurons and post-ganglionic neurons. Pre-ganglionic neurons are the ones before the ganglion. Post-ganglionic neurons are the ones after. Now, unfortunately, it works a little bit differently depending on whether we're in the sympathetic or the parasympathetic. This is an example of the sympathetic division. So here, this pre-ganglionic neuron is short. We have a short pre-ganglionic neuron and then a long post-ganglionic neuron. So for these, we have these spinal nerves coming off here. The ganglion would be right about here. They're lined up right down either side of the spinal cord. And then we have long post-ganglionic neurons that come off and then connect to the organs here. In the parasympathetic division, we have a long presympathetic and a short a long pre-ganglionic and a short post-ganglionic. The ganglion, instead of being next to the spinal cord, is next to the organ. Okay? So the ganglia in the sympathetic and parasympathetic are in different locations. Make sure you know in the sympathetic and parasympathetic, is the ganglion close to the spinal cord or is it close to the effector? And based off that, you can figure out which neuron is the long one. Because if the ganglion is next to the spinal cord, the first one's going to be short. It doesn't have to go very far. The second one has to be long. If the ganglion is next to the effector, it's next to the organ, it's up here, then the first one has to be really long to get there. And the second one is then short. This is what we just talked about. In the sympathetic division, we have preganglionic neurons, postganglionic neurons. In the sympathetic, the neurons that lead to the ganglion, which is near the spinal cord, with a short preganglionic, a long postganglionic. Having a change of heart. If you printed the slides, cross that one out. Don't worry about this.
Do you know what number that is?
I can find it.
We point the whole slide or?
The whole
or-
slide. The whole slide. That is slide 58. I do want to go back to this one. So, here, in here, so in the ganglion, and at the effector, we have a synapse. And in the ganglion, we're going to go from one neuron to another. At the end, we need to go from a neuron to the effector. In the ganglion, we always use acetylcholine, the ACH. That's the same ACH we learned about at the muscle, up here. Same exact thing. In the ganglion, we use ACH. In the parasympathetic division, at the end, we use ACH. The oddball out is here. In the sympathetic division, between the postganglionic neuron and the effector, we use norepinephrine. It can also be called noradrenaline. Same thing. Okay? So we have 4 different places, 2 ganglia and 2 effectors. In both ganglia, it's an ACH. In the parasympathetic effector, we use ACH. The only one that is not ACH is between the postganglionic neuron and the effector in the sympathetic division. We have 2 different neurotransmitters. ACH is used everywhere except in that one situation. So all these words are basically trying to show you and tell you the route that these neurons can go. Okay? So here we have the spinal cord. Here we have the ganglia lined up next to it. Don't take too much out of this. Okay? All I want you to take out of this is that when this comes out of the spinal cord and goes into a ganglion, it can go a lot of different places. It can go straight from here to an organ. It can go up and over. It can go down and over. There are some of them, I'm not seeing them any here though, that can actually turn back around, go back up here, up, over, and out. These neurons are long and crazy. They go all over the place. Talked about that. Don't need to worry about that. That's what I just talked about. Boy, I get ahead of myself. I think I know something. I'm telling you something important that's not coming up, and I forget that it is coming up. So, autonomic nervous system can use acetylcholine or epinephrine. The only ones that don't are the postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic division. The sympathetic division causes fight or flight. That's that stress response. It's going to turn things on. If we turn things on, we need to fight or flight. What are some things in our body that you think we need to turn on?
Eyeballs.
Eyeballs? What about it?
Like, open your eyes, you just heard a loud noise.
Yeah. It's not only your eyelids, but what else? Anybody have a cat?
I got 3.
What happens to a cat when you make a sudden movement? What happens to their eyes? It gets like really quick. Okay? All you gotta do is kind of go like that, and their eyes they just constantly go like this. Okay? So that is a reflex. That is controlled, at least in part, by the autonomic nervous system. There's some of that reflex arc going on there, but it's also fight or flight. The sympathetic nervous system kicks in, pupils open up. Why do you think? Why is it going to work like that?
So I can see more.
So you can see wider view. Okay? Let light in. Okay? What else? What else would be connected to fight or flight? If I need to fight, what do I need to do?
Adrenaline.
I need adrenaline, yes. And so we said the effectors can be muscles, like the muscles that are open our pupils. They can also be glands. We're going to learn about the adrenal glands. And so in that case, the sympathetic division is going to turn on the adrenal glands to create adrenaline, which is going to hype me up. What else do you think needs to happen to my body if I'm going to fight?
Sweat glands.
I'm not going to need sweat glands.
Feet.
Kind of like stiffen up and like brace yourself.
Muscle, you can tense your muscles, which could have a couple of different functions. Why would you tense up?
To like protect your internal organs.
Yeah, so it's as a kind of an armor. So if you tense your muscles, they get hard, and so if you get hit, it's not going to damage what's underneath. Why else would you want your muscles tense?
To look tougher.
Yeah, it would look big, try to intimidate whatever you're trying to fight. What else? If I'm trying to fight, if I'm a human being, okay, and I'm fighting someone and I don't have weapons, how am I going to fight them?
With my
For like more
Probably
strength.
with my fists. And so a tensed muscle is going to punch harder than a soft muscle. Okay? What other part of my body do you think is going to respond to the sympathetic fight or flight?
Your heart.
Heart.
Pumping.
My heart's going to speed up. Why?
to pump the adrenaline.
Pump the adrenaline. Yes, I need to get that adrenaline all over the place. What else?
We're gonna need more oxygen.
I'm going to need more oxygen. The muscles that I'm going to use to fight or flight are going to need a lot of oxygen. And so I better start pumping faster. What else? What else is going to speed up or happen? Not brain. We need a bunch of oxygen.
Yeah.
My heart can only pump the oxygen that it has,
You start breathing faster.
so I breathe faster. My breathing rate's going to go up. So I'm going to bring in more oxygen. What do you think is going to happen to blood in my body?
It's gonna be moving faster, so it's gonna get
Where do you think it's going to go?
everywhere.
To your
To your muscles.
lungs and heart. and
So
brain.
let's say it can move to the outside of my body, or it can move to the inside of my body.
It's not gonna go to your organs.
You know, your lungs, your legs and arms. You can wait along.
So think of it this way. Where do I need my blood? If I'm fighting or flighting?
Your heart.
It needs to be in my heart so it can get pumped, but the heart's pumping it fast to get it someplace.
To your muscles.
To my muscles, right? So my muscles are away from my core. But if I am fighting, what's likely to happen to me?
I'm gonna get hit.
I'm going to get hit. I'm going to bleed. Exactly. That's exactly where I am going. So if I'm going to get injured, I want to minimize blood loss. And so I'm going to take blood and get it to the most important muscles, but I'm going to take it away from my skin. The muscles that I don't need to fight or flight are not going to get blood. So if I get cut, I don't bleed out. Okay? What happens if I'm not fighting or flighting and my parasympathetic division is winning out? The angel on the shoulder is winning. My heart is going to do what?
Rest.
Rest. This parasympathetic is what determines your resting heart rate. Right now, my sympathetic division is not kicked into gear. And so my heart rate, my breathing are controlled by my parasympathetic. Parasympathetic is always sending basically the same signal. But when the sympathetic division starts shouting, it shouts over the parasympathetic, and you're going to listen to the person that's shouting at you. Okay? What about where, do you remember, so we said sympathetic is fight or flight. What did we say was the phrase for the parasympathetic class? Rest and digest. Exactly. So, where do you think the blood is going to go now?
Your organs.
My digestive organs. If I am fighting or flighting, it doesn't matter how quickly I'm digesting my cheeseburger I had for lunch, right? If I'm dead, who cares? But eventually I have to digest that cheeseburger. And so when I'm resting and digesting, the blood is going to my intestines, to my stomach, to help digest all of that stuff. So, you had asked a question, an example of a situation where they were reversed. Is that, what was your question that?
I don't know, but you said it's gonna be one time and then it's for.
Oh, when they go in the same direction.
Yes, that's what it was.
So, something like the heart is where the sympathetic division cranks it up, parasympathetic slows it down. My intestines are where the sympathetic slows it down, parasympathetic cranks it up. Can you, I was thinking I had it coming up. Can you think of a situation where you may want both working together?
They give you extra tip?
Thought processing.
So, autonomic nervous system is going to work with effectors, muscles, organs, and glands. Can you think of an organ, a muscle, or a gland where you may want them working together?
So you may want them both to speed up and both to slow down.
Yes.
Your hair growth.
We, fortunately or unfortunately, can't control that at all. What's
Even though I can.
Let's start with. This is multiple choice.
Yeah.
well, it's kind of multiple choice because it's one of the muscles, organs, or glands in our body.
True, that's everything.
But that's there's multiple choices there. And there's a finite number of choices. So.
Heart.
So in heart, parasympathetic slows it down, sympathetic turns it up. It's something, one of the examples is something that we mentioned.
Your emotions.
Starts with an A.
Alcohol.
Alcohol just messes everything up. It just makes everything stop working.
I forgot the question.
Something in our body, you don't need to listen to this. Lecture is about our senses. The vast majority of this is going to be about the special senses because they're special. They're very specialized, which is why they're special senses. They're very different from each other. Your eyes function nothing like your ears, which function nothing like your nose. So we have to learn each one of them separate. The general senses are pretty straightforward. We have a receptor attached to a nerve, and it leads to the spinal cord and then the brain. So there's not too much to cover in the general senses. Our senses give us sensations. And a sensation is our ability to be aware of our environment. If we are not aware of our environment, what's going to happen? If you can't see, what's going to happen?
Panic.
Did you say panic?
Yeah, you can't see.
Well,
You're not gonna know what's
You're
happening.
disabled. You don't know what's going
Don't know
on.
where to go.
Right.
You,
you're not aware of threats. You can't get food. You can't. It's very difficult, right? You have to rely on your other senses. And luckily, our brain is good enough that people with one disability can get by with very little problem in a lot of cases. If you lose your hearing, same thing. It's a problem, but you can get around it. Other senses like taste isn't as big a deal. Why do you think we have taste if it's not such a big deal if we lose it?
so then we'll know you can never know.
And why is that a bad thing?
Because
It could be something poisonous.
Could eat something poisonous. Generally, poisonous things don't taste good. Also, there's a reason that things like sugar and fat taste good. Why?
Because we need it.
We need it. Why?
keep them more fat in our
You said to keep going. What do you mean?
For energy.
For energy, yeah. So, luckily, in our society, people usually don't have to worry about starving to death. Not saying it doesn't happen. Some of us are more fortunate than others, but for the most part, people do not starve to death. Back in the hunter-gatherer days, people living in a cave, they did starve to death. And so if they were going to spend their time finding things to eat and then eating it, they wanted to eat things with lots of calories in them. Which is why things with lots of calories taste good. Unfortunately, now that we have basically all the food that we can have, we want to eat the things that have a bunch of calories, not the things that don't. For one of these sensations to occur, whether it be a general sense or a special sense, we have to have 4 things that are going to happen. Number 1, we have to have a stimulus. What that stimulus is going to depend on what sensation we're talking about. If I'm talking about my eyesight, what do you think the stimulus is that starts this sensation? Light. Light is going to hit my eye. What about my hearing? Sound. What is sound? You know? It's vibrations. So vibration is going to hit my ear. What about a general sense like touch? What is the stimulus? Pressure, yes. The pressure, when I push, actually is going to cause an action potential, like we talked about the last couple days, in the neurons in my fingers. And it's going to cause the action potential to come up my arm, to my spinal cord, to my brain. So we have to have a stimulus, then we have to have a receptor that senses that stimulus. That's going to be the rods and the cones in my eye. It's going to be the cochlea in my ear. It's the actual pressure and touch sensors in my skin. That is the sensory receptor. It's going to take the stimulus and create that action potential or nerve impulse. Those are the same exact thing. Action potential is a nerve impulse. We then have to take that nerve impulse and we have to get it to the brain. So it's going to get passed along neurons all the way up my arm to my spinal cord, up to my brain. And then my brain needs to take that stimulus, which was turned into an impulse, and it needs to integrate it. Integrate means to make sense of. So it's going to receive that signal, it's going to make sense of it, and then it's going to take all of the nerve impulses it's receiving and create what we perceive as consciousness. What is around us? Because everything we perceive around us is coming from these senses. If we had no senses, none at all, we would not be aware of anything going on around us. We would not have what we consider our consciousness. That conscious awareness is called perception. This is going to happen in the cerebral cortex, the outermost part of our brain. Do you remember what kind of matter is on the outside of the brain?
Gray.
Gray. And why do you think it is gray matter at the edge of the brain?
Not as much as dark.
Not as much what?
It's unmyelinated.
It's unmyelinated, yes. That's why it's gray. Why do you think unmyelinated tissue is on the outside of the brain? Remember, what is the purpose of myelin?
Send signals.
It helps to conduct signals faster. What can you tell me about the order in which signals go if I touch something? It goes to my finger, up my arm, to my spinal cord, into my brain. You know, when it reaches the top of my brain, it has nowhere else to go. The top of the brain is the end of the line. The top of the brain doesn't need to conduct signals. All it does is receive signals and then send new signals back out. So that's why perception is going to happen in the cerebral cortex. That is where the gray matter of our cerebrum is located. The white matter underneath it is primarily going to be used for transferring signals from the inner brain, the diencephalon, out to the cerebral cortex. Adaptation is a term for something that you have experienced all the time. What do they talk? You've seen the Febreze commercials where somebody walks into someone else's house or someone else's room and they say that person has gone what? Nose blind. Going nose blind is an example of adaptation. When we sense something for a very, very long time, we normally decrease how strong we sense that thing. So if we're smelling something, over time we don't smell it anymore. If I put my hand on this table, I immediately sense I put my hand on that table, but after about 30 seconds, I'm not feeling that table anymore. If I change the pressure, now I can feel it. If everything stays the same, I don't feel it. What happens when you go into a bright room? You go from dark into bright. Your pupil constricts, but even your pupil is going to constrict in a matter of a second or two. But it's still really bright, right? What eventually happens? Not mechanistically, but just what you see happening. You see spots and then you get used to it. That getting used to it is adaptation. If we have a prolonged stimulus, we get a whole bunch of light for a long period of time, our eyes are going to get used to it. Why do you think we undergo adaptation? Why do we go nose blind? Why do we get used to the extra light coming into our eyes? I think it's probably easier to imagine with the eyes. If you walk from a dark place into a light place, and you got all that light coming in, can you see very well? No, you can't. Because everything else is being overwhelmed by that sunlight. If you're in a place and there's a very, very strong smell, and you don't go nose blind, are you going to be able to smell all of the other smaller, weaker smells in the room? No. And so if there's a very strong something going on, we register that in our brain and say, wow, that's really strong, and then we kind of turn it down. We try to keep in our mind that that strong sensation is there, but we've turned it down so that we can sense other things. The receptors that receive the stimulus, convert it into a nerve impulse, come in three types. There are free nerve endings, encapsulated nerve endings, and separate cells. A free nerve ending is just a nerve that comes to an end. And all you have is basically an axon that sticks into nowhere. not an axon, a dendrite. You have dendrites that stick into nowhere. An encapsulated nerve ending is going to be a nerve ending, a nerve that just stops, but there's going to be a little membrane around it that almost makes it look like its own special little thing. And then a separate cell is a cell at the end of a nerve that's going to take a sensation and send that into a dendrite and the neuron to send it up the arm, up the spinal cord, into the brain. Don't worry too much about the fine details of these three things, but I would like you to have that general sense of the difference between them. A free nerve ending is just a nerve that just runs into a dead end. If you put a little cap on the end, you have an encapsulated nerve ending, and then you have cells themselves. So here we have some examples. So this is a receptor here. This is a receptor here. This is a free nerve ending. That's going to be primarily pain and temperature. Here we have encapsulated nerve ending. And here we have a cell. But I hope you can at least see the big difference between that one and these. And then you might be able to see a little bit of difference between that one and that one. These have little bulbs on the end, whereas that one does not. Our general senses are generally going to fall into what we call our somatic senses. And those are mostly going to be tactile senses. There's touch. Remember, we have sensors in our dermis, some at the top for light touch, some at the bottom of the dermis for hard pressure. Those make up our tactile senses. They can also detect other things though. We don't just have light touch and pressure. There's vibration. Vibration is different. It's slightly different, but it's a very rapid change in pressure.
Can you go back real quick?
Yeah.
What is the difference? Oh, this is wait. Tactile is touch, pressure, vibration, itch, and tickle.
Touch is light touch.
Okay.
Pressure is heavy touch.
So vibration, itch, and tickle are not tactile sensations?
They are. It's a continued.
Okay. Do we need to know something about touch other than touch and pressure other than pressure?
No, as for touch and pressure, we've already covered in the skin
Okay.
lecture. Then there's the weird itch and tickle. I dare you to describe tickle. It's not going to happen. Okay? Tickle doesn't have a clear purpose. It's kind of an out of control itch. Itch does have a purpose. What do you think is the purpose of itch other than to annoy us?
So that you know you're allergic to something.
So that you know something's wrong, right? If you get a bug that starts crawling along your arm, you're gonna feel that. You're gonna get a little itch, right? Or if that mosquito bites you, it's gonna itch. Your body knows something is wrong there. It's bringing your attention to it. Unfortunately, the itch part of our brain isn't smart enough to discriminate between itches that we can do something about and itches that we can't. If we have something that's burrowing into our skin and we scratch it, that's going to help. We're going to try to get that thing off of us. But if we just have a welt from a mosquito bite, scratching is a bad thing, right? We have our thermoreceptors, which are our temperature senses. There are separate ones for cold and warm. There are separate sensors. We have nociceptors, which are pain receptors. Same thing. A nociceptor is a receptor that senses pain. And then we have the very odd proprioceptive receptors. This is what tells me, somehow, it's like magic, where my body parts are. Okay? If I close my eyes and I go like this, I know where my hand is. And I can still reach down and pick up this thing that I just set down. I know where my hand is even though I can't see where my hand is. Those are proprioceptive receptors which give us the sense of proprioception. It's how, if I'm walking and I see something on the floor, I can step over it, I can move my hand, my foot around it. I don't have to look at it and slowly do it. I see it, I know where it is, I know where my foot is, so I just move it around it.
Is it true if you lose a limb that you still feel like it's there?
I believe so, yeah.
What's that called?
Ghost pains.
No,
Ghost?
But the pain is ghost pain.
Phantom pain.
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
Absolutely.
Phantom.
So would that still be like related to your proprio?
That would be.
Both.
I don't. I think it's both. I don't know anyone this has happened to. You hear about the phantom pains.
Yeah.
I think they also have some of this. It just, even if it doesn't hurt, it's like it feels like it's there. Then we move on to our special senses. Okay. General senses, don't make too much out of that. Okay. Now we have our special senses. We'll go through each one. First one we're going to cover is smell. This is called olfaction. We have, depending on how old we are for the most part, 10 to 100 million receptors for smell. Some of it's genetic, some of it's age. As we get older, they go down. But some people simply have more receptors. Okay? It's like how a dog can smell a whole lot better than we can. They have more of these receptors than we do. Some people have more than others, but it's a much smaller difference between something like a human and a dog. Imagine I breathe a bunch of air in. Behind my nose is a large cavity. Just an open area behind my nose. That is called the nasal cavity. At the roof of that nasal cavity, here is something called the olfactory epithelium. So I'm breathing air in here, there's a big open space behind it. At the roof of that nasal cavity is the olfactory epithelium. At the olfactory epithelium, we have three types of cells. The most important one is the olfactory receptors. Remember when we took the top part of the skull off? We had a bone in the front, it was kind of oval shaped. You remember the name of that bone?
Is this something about
Cello Persica?
In front of the cell turcica.
Is it the girl?
Crystal,
The-
Dollar?
Yeah.
The crista galli are the holes in that bone. You remember the name of the bone?
I don't remember the bone.
It starts with an E.
I don't know.
E-T?
S-
E-T-H?
Epithelial?
I don't know.
Are you spelling this right?
E-T-H-M?
No.
Ethmoid.
Ethmoid.
Oh.
You got over halfway through it though. There's only 7 letters, but it took 4. Remember, in the ethmoid bone we had the crista galli, and I said the little fingers of the nerve are going to stick down through those holes. Olfactory receptors. And then we have a couple of other types of cells that serve only to help these do their job. Supporting cells are going to maintain the environment around them, and basal cells are going to be more structural. They're going to create this epithelial layer, and then buried in that are going to be the other 2 types. The way that we tell the difference between one smell and another is because in these receptors, we have a lot of different types. They all sense different smells. So if I breathe in one smell, it's going to cause some receptors to fire, but not other ones. So every time we breathe something in, we have a unique combination of those receptors going. And that combination of senses is what we sense as a specific smell. When a molecule that we're smelling, because we are smelling individual molecules, the individual molecule is going to come in and bind to one of these receptors. It's going to cause a nerve impulse. When it binds, it is the stimulus that brings us up the threshold that causes us to depolarize. Remember in our graph, we had a little bump and then a big bump. And that little bump is the stimulus. In smell, that stimulus is caused by an odor molecule binding to the olfactory receptor. So this is what we're talking about. We have the ethmoid bone and the cristogalli in it. The part of the ethmoid bone that has the cristogalli we call the cribriform plate. This is one of those cranial nerves. The cranial nerve literally comes out the front of the brain, comes up right here to the top of that nasal cavity, branches out into little fingers, and sticks down into the nasal cavity. That's the only part of our body where our brain is directly in contact with the outside world. When I breathe in, that air that I'm breathing in directly touches olfactory nerve number 1. And that is directly attached to the brain. The end of that nerve is going to carry a signal to the olfactory bulb. And when we see a picture, there's got to be a better picture. Nope. I want to find you a better picture. So if we look at the bottom of the brain here, this was the diagram that we had of our cranial nerves, and I said you weren't going to have to pick out each one. But here we see cranial nerve 1. It comes out, and it forms a little bulb at the end. It's just a wide spot, and then sticking down off that bulb are the little fingers that come down through the cristogalli. We had the bulb, and then we had a little stalk that connected to the brain. That stalk between the brain and the bulb was the olfactory tract. If it gets to the brain, and then it's going to move within the brain to go to the part of our brain that's in charge of smell. That's going to be it's spread out in the brain. You're not going to have to learn where specifically in the brain that happens. So here we talked, breathe in air, it comes into here, some of it touches the little nerve sticking down here. This is the bulb, and then sends it up through the olfactory tract and attaches to the brain here, and then the senses can go wherever they want in the brain. Zooming in further, this hole here is one of those cristogalli. So we've zoomed way in. This is the olfactory bulb here. And then we have the fingers that stick down through the cristogalli. We're sticking down through the cristogalli. This is the olfactory epithelium. But you notice if you follow them, they continue all the way down to the bottom here. After smell is taste. The technical term for taste is gustation. It's a weird word, we don't use it at all in the real world. Like with our smell, where we have a set number of smells that we can sense, and then all the different smells that we experience are a different combination of those. For taste, we only have 5. You're familiar with sour, sweet, bitter, and salty. The last one is umami. I don't know why there's not a specific English word for that one. Because certainly there is other words in other languages for these. For me, I just make it something like meaty, right? We sense umami flavor as meaty. Do you know where you are most exposed to the idea or the sense of umami?
Steak.
Oh, well, this is
It's a specific type of food.
meat,
Oh.
steak.
Not just meat. There's a type of food where they add an ingredient.
Asian.
Say it again?
Asian?
Asian. Do you know what the ingredient is that adds umami flavor? It's something people have an unfair, bad image of. People are scared of.
Artichokes.
Some people are allergic to it, so that one's
Peanut shellfish? No.
starts with an M.
Mushroom sauce.
When you order Chinese food, sometimes you can ask for your food with or without this ingredient.
MSG.
MSG.
Oh.
Do you know what MSG is?
Nope.
Are you scared of MSG?
It makes you stupid.
It does not. Do you know what MSG stands for?
Chemical. Muscularly.
No. No. Monosodium glutamate. Do you know what glutamate is?
Yeah. Sugar.
No.
What?
Fat.
It's an amino acid.
Oh.
You know the 20 amino acids that all the proteins in our body are made out of? Glutamate is the simplest possible one.
So it was,
Do we eat
what
the
was
other
it
one?
again?
And so it's monosodium glutamate. Monosodium means it's a glutamate with one sodium. But sodium's not a bad thing. Sodium is in sodium chloride. That's salt.
So why are people scared?
It's bad. People are scared of it because some people are allergic to it.
Is it blood?
But if you're not allergic to it, the only bad thing about it is it has sodium in it, which some people raises blood pressure.
So that's why you get so bloated after you eat it.
But
So
there,
is MSG not in other kinds of food then?
it is naturally. It
Okay.
is naturally,
But they add it.
but they
by
add
taste.
it to get the savory or meaty flavor.
No wonder I think it's so
Yeah, that's what it
It's
is.
in Western foods, it's very rare. I mean, you can go to a grocery store and they won't even sell MSG. So the gustatory pathway, so the pathway of taste uses 3 cranial nerves. You do not need to know the specific ones that are involved in taste. Once we receive that signal, taste signal in our mouth, it's going to go to a number of places, but the primary one is in the parietal lobe of the cerebral cortex. Where is the parietal lobe?
Here. Behind the front.
The top sides, right? Where is the cerebral cortex?
Hold on. Right here? Cerebral?
Cerebral cortex.
In there. I guessed it.
We talked about it not that long ago. It's where the gray matter is. Where's the gray matter?
Here.
The outside of the brain. So, if you get nothing more out of this, okay, and you say, how am I going to use this stuff in my real life? When am I ever going to use this stuff? At least you can be a smart aleck. When somebody talks about the taste, you can see the taste buds on their tongue. Because what you see on someone's tongue is not taste buds. Taste buds are microscopic. Okay? You're not seeing taste buds. What you are seeing are papilla. The bumps on your tongue are papilla. The taste buds are individual cells on those papilla.
How many is on each?
A whole bunch. I don't know the number, but they're
Thousands or millions?
probably millions. Probably millions.
On each taste bud, or not taste bud.
So, this is the mouth. We didn't figure that out. We've got a tongue here, we've got the papilla here. Taste buds are not only on the papilla on your tongue. There are other places in your mouth, like the roof of your mouth and the back of your throat, where we have taste buds.
Papilla or taste buds?
Taste buds. Taste buds. On your tongue, they are on papilla.
So they're not under my tongue?
No.
Oh, God.
There are different shapes of papilla. You don't have to learn them. If you're interested, look it up online, okay? They come in really weird shapes. They look like little aliens growing on your tongue, okay?
You know, like when you drink too much soda and then your tongue gets irritated, like it gets like a little.
Like,
Yeah,
well,
I don't know.
it turns like, it gets kind of sensitive and like kind of painful.
Yeah, like if I drink soda like every single day, like I'll get like one that like hurts for a day and then it goes away.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it's kinda like sensitive
Like
and
the
sour.
sour.
Is it like a
Well,
blister?
if I eat Sour Patch Kids, mine does that.
Yeah,
You're
like
talking
at
like a
the
little
end of your
blister?
tongue? Yeah, it's like at the end of your tongue.
Yeah, like
yeah,
That-
like
that's
all
a-
the white one.
That's a canker sore.
No.
No, it's not.
It's on
It's
your
really.
tongue.
It's like it looks like the little.
It's
Papillas.
pink. It'll turn like bright red,
Yeah.
It's just like, you know,
like it's ready to burst.
Yeah.
My mom calls it a lie bump.
A lie bump?
Yeah, if you tell a lie, you get a bump on your
I'm,
We're both nudging.
Yeah.
Who knows it?
I don't think I'm all that
But you
familiar.
don't, 'cause
I'm
I'm
still
still dead.
Not advised.
You don't know what we're talking about?
No.
You've never had one?
I get-
Like, put your
Oh, they're
hands
so
on the
I get
irritating.
little canker sores on the tip of my tongue, but
Maybe that's what it is.
No,
You're
it
okay.
ain't.
Maybe you think
They're
it's
really
canker sore,
tiny.
but we're thinking it's something different.
but my thing is an actual term.
Ours is.
Ours is a little tongue cover.
So we're talking about these papilla, and I said they're very oddly shaped. Some of them, this is another mind-blowing thing, you may not know. Some of them look like sea anemones.
I think you're saying that wrong.
See, that was my point. I was going to say it's backwards from what you think, but I think I said it. It's an anemone. It's anemone, not anemone. Everybody says anemone, but it's anemone.
You just said it.
It's anemone. Anemone.
Anemone.
Moving on. Okay, so that's taste. Again, not too much to know about taste. Just please don't tell me you can see taste buds unless you have really, really good vision.
I would feel them
Okay?
when they're swollen.
You feel swollen papilla or canker sores, whichever it is. You're not feeling individual canker
I
sores.
thought canker sores
It's
were
not
on the
individual.
sides of your.
It's anywhere in the mouth.
Oh.
Let me look this up. You sure?
I don't know.
We'll take a break. If you want to look it up, what the lie bumps are, you can look it up. We'll start at somewhere between 7 and 5 after, once everybody's back and ready.
All right, great.
So you got 5-10 minutes.
Maybe I can for a walk. Walgreens.
We're gonna put on this down, see if your thoughts. Why are you going with your keys?
Oh, my wallet's in my car. Oh, I guess we could drive there.
It's towards your apartment.
quiz, are we still on skeletal or is it on muscle?
Muscle. So there will be one question on the muscle fiber model, and then there will be one question on the head and neck.
I wouldn't make it through 1 second.
I attempted that, I wasn't like eavesdropping, but
They're
I
not,
was
I
like,
like every day and they're like Titan Zero.
There's no way
I
I
was
could do that.
like face planting.
Then I see where you put both your feet on this cardboard, or like on a big, plastic plate. And then slide up, slide down.
They're called sliders and they came with the beach bike. My
Do you do
beach
that?
bike, I just started it.
How do you like
Well, I start Monday, the actual workout, but I'm in detox right now and it's
Oh.
like, I'm dying right now. It's very hard.
How
but-
long is the detox?
3 days.
Oh, but
You
you
can have anything. It's literally fruit,
Oh.
veggies, water, and protein shakes in this fiber drink, and it's all very, very thick. It doesn't taste bad.
No, I can't
It,
stand
it
it.
hurts. Like it's awful. Like Justin came to see it work, and he's like, "When is the last day of this detox shit?" Because I'm being really mean. He's like, "You're a freaking bitch." I'm like, okay, sorry. But yeah, it's hard.
How bad is it?
But I've like previewed one of the workouts, and it's gonna be really hard.
What do you have to do?
So one of them is called the zoo workout. They call it the zoo workout because everything you do is like that, like is like an animal, has an animal name to it. And I'm like,
Oh, Jesus.
but do you know who Autumn is? The woman who started Beachbody. Her name's Autumn. I don't know her last name.
Is she from Bradford?
No, like she started Beach, like not.
No.
She's one of the, I think she did the 21 day fix, I'm not really sure. I'm doing 80-day obsession, so it's 80 days.
What's the 21 day thing?
It's a part of each body, but your workouts are only 30 minutes a day, and you still have the containers for, like, your food. Like, you have to measure everything you eat. Like, it goes off how much you weigh, how many calories you can have, and there's like a carb one, a protein one.
You do this Shakeology?
Shakeology is amazing, yes, and it's very
It works?
expensive, but it's very good.
How much did that cost?
It was $280 for a beach spot for what I'm doing right now, and then the cleanse, like the 3-day detox, was $40 extra. But
So
I
that's like-
haven't dieted or worked out in probably a year, but it's really caught up with me. So my body was like shocked. I drink like 5 or 6 Diet Cokes a day, which is really, really bad because of the fake sugar in it. But so I've had nothing but water for 3 days, and I'm about to die.
And that does take a toll on you.
It's hard. Like I was in such a bad mood today because I was starving. I'm like, But you can eat, like, everything on the list I like. There's not any of the food that I don't like. You just, when you're cleansing, like you're detoxing, you can't have any meat. You can't eat any cheese, meat, anything, even if it doesn't have carbs or it's not fat, and you have no meat. It's like, have you ever bought spinach leaves, like spinach?
I love spinach leaves.
I've never done it until last week, and I was thinking, this is gonna be disgusting, but it's really good, so, like, I'll probably never eat regular lettuce unless.
I hate
I'm
romaine
at a-
lettuce. I hate it.
I'm at a restaurant or something, I don't know, but, my Beachbody coach said that I could take a handful of spinach and put it in my Shakeology with like a little bit of plain oats, and that could be my breakfast, because I don't like to eat in the morning.
I hate
But
it.
I
It
can
makes
drink
me sick.
something. But she said if you mix it all together, if you have like a really good blender, I have the magic bullet, it works really good. She said you can't even tell that it's in there. So I'm excited about that. But I don't start that until Monday, and I'm like,
I do a handful of spinach and peanut butter and almond milk, and that tastes just like peanut butter.
in like a smoothie?
Yeah.
Really?
And it, yeah. it
With
tastes-
ice though,
And
or-
banana.
A banana.
Yeah, and it tastes just like a banana peanut butter.
Have you
smoothie.
ever heard of PB2?
Yeah.
Okay.
I sometimes supplement it.
Yeah.
If I don't have
I
peanut
bought
butter.
that one. I bought PB2 and the chocolate one just because I wanted extra protein. So I'm like,
And
but
you
it's not as fattening as like regular peanut
Yeah.
butter. So
But you can't taste it. Just it turns out green, kind of junky looking.
yeah,
But
it
other
looks
than that,
bad,
it
but you
tastes.
can't taste it.
Yeah, it tastes amazing to me.
It's a super food dose. It's super good for you. It's like blueberries.
Yeah. I don't like blueberries.
Oh, they're so good for you though. Like I make myself
The
eat them.
texture.
That's not even great for a little bit.
I love berries, but blueberries gross me out.
She's so cute. She is a lot beautiful. So she got a oversized teddy bear from Harley. And look what I had to do last night. That's what I did for lunch. Freaking up in that would be really love. This is when I left the house and figured it was asleep on the couch, and she was asleep. She grabbed it and went. So I get home last night, she's in my bed. That's why I got to sleep with last night. Good overtime, huh? Hey, Carly. So this is the spinach. This is what I did, yesterday. Yeah. You know, well, it doesn't really have a taste, but it's like you're eating a salad, so. I didn't even gain that much on it, but like, how did this happen? Divorce, school. When Dusty started acting like adopting another child. I had told him I was gonna buy it. I have a whole gym at my house. I don't want to use it. I don't want to use it. I just buy a brand new. I have a brand new for the total body for these stuff. I have that for one of the ones that
There you go.
Washington cover. Having jewels on it and pull my logo on it.
There's no telling how far they went to get food. So we're gonna stand.
Walgreens is right there, and I think they walk.
We'll get going. The next is vision. So the two we have left are vision and, vision, hearing and balance. Hearing and balance are both in our ears. So we have our eyes and our ears yet to do. So we're going to spend most of the time talking about the eye. But vision also is going to include some accessory structures whose purpose is to help the eye do what it's going to do. So what do you think is the function of your eyebrows? How is that going to help your eyes?
Keep stuff out.
Block sweat.
It blocks sweat from getting in your eyes. It's going to help collect some like dirt that might try to get in your eyes. It's also going to kind of help cut down on glare. It's going to, some of the very bright light coming up from above, you're going to get cut down by the eyebrows. What eyelashes? Function of an eyelash. Say it again? Keep things out of your eye. What about the eyelids? Protection. Yeah. That way we can close our eyes, and even though the eyelids are very thin, at least we have some sort of covering over our eyes, which are very, very sensitive to trauma and impact. Then we have extrinsic eye muscles. Extrinsic eye muscles are the muscles outside of our eye. Think external. What do you think these muscles do? Why would we have muscles outside of our eye? So I am going to look over here, but look at her. What does that have to do with anything?
So it helps.
Pull.
Yeah, it moves the eyeball. The eyeball sits in a socket in one place, and then the external muscles pull in different directions so we can look in different directions. So that's what we're seeing here. There's one, they're cut, so you can't see them, but down in here you can see some that are attached. So that's going to pull in different directions and let us look in different directions rather than just straight forward. Then there is the lacrimal apparatus, which is something you're very familiar with, but you probably have no idea what it is. Nope. Eyelid's got its own bullet.
What's the question again?
The lacrimal apparatus is something you are very familiar with, but you probably never. The tear duct and the tear gland. You know those, but you've never heard it called the lacrimal apparatus. So we'll learn about that, what it does and where it is. What is the main purpose of the tear system?
To clean out your something.
Keep your eyes moist
Moist and clean.
and clean, yeah.
And clean. Because if our eyes dry out, that eyeball has to move around in its socket. Dry eye is an actual thing that people have problems with. They don't make enough tears. They have commercials on TV for that all the time.
Dry eyes.
Yeah. I imagine that's probably a very, very uncomfortable
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
I know people, I don't wear contacts, but I know if you wear contacts, you have to keep them very moist, otherwise it gets very, very uncomfortable. But it's also for cleaning, so that when we do get dust in our eyes, it's in the tears, not on our eyeball, and so the tears are constantly flowing through as we flush that stuff out. And we talk about the eyeball itself, and there are 3 layers to the eyeball. The outer one is the fibrous tunic, the middle one is the vascular tunic, and then the inner one is the retina. These 3 layers have other specific parts to them. For example, the fibrous tunic is the sclera and the cornea. For the most part, going forward, we're going to talk about the specific parts. But you do need to know, big picture, which of these 3 layers that falls under. So we'll talk about the sclera and the cornea, the choroid, ciliary body, and the iris. But right now, later on, we're going to talk about the retina as a retina. Right now, I want to talk about the 2 layers of the retina. We have a neural layer and a pigmented layer. You can simplify what these are, okay? The neural layer is the layer of the retina that actually senses the light. The retina is the part of our eyeball that senses the light, and in the retina, that is the neural layer. Neuron, that's where this whole thing is going to start. Then there is the pigmented layer. And you're familiar with the pigmented layer of the retina. Anybody have any idea why you are familiar with that?
Because it goes to eye color.
You know, eye color we'll learn is the iris, which is the outside here. Where else do you see color in an eye? Or when else?
Why?
What's a situation where you see color in an eyeball that's not this color? You're 100% correct. That's not what I was thinking of. But yes, jaundice, you get yellow in your eye.
When you are in poison ivy.
Nope.
What's the question again?
What's a situation where you can see color in an eye? A lot of times you don't.
Correct.
Okay, so color, like where the sclera is?
No, so inside. So the retina's on the back of your eyeball.
Cataracts.
Nope.
Yes. Astigmatism.
Nope. A little less of a bad thing. You don't want it. You don't want it, but it's not so bad.
Missing eyeball.
So you just went to Walgreens, right?
Yep.
When you were in Walgreens, they had a photo department, right? If you got into one of the little kiosks,
Flash, sunlight.
what happens with a flash in the eyeballs?
Your pupil gets bigger.
No,
You
it
see
does.
it. You see the flash.
Think not about your eye, but the picture itself.
Oh, they go red.
Red eye. Or you're driving down the road and your headlights hit an animal. You see that the green eyes looking at you.
Or
You're-
the car lights coming at you.
You're seeing that. You're seeing that pigmented layer of the retina.
Oh yes, like when you take a picture of somebody
Red eye.
and you see that their eyes are red.
Yeah, it looks like they're possessed by the devil.
Yes.
They got the
Yeah,
bright
yeah,
red
that's-
eyes. Right?
Catching it on the photo.
You're seeing the pigmented layer. In us, that pigment is mostly red. In a lot of other animals, it's mostly bluish red, bluish green. And so you see that color.
What's yellow? What's the animal that's yellow eyed?
Sasquatch? Is it yellow?
Isn't that, yeah.
You said you gator. So you shine spotlights on, so that's what you're looking for. Okay. So this is the lacrimal apparatus. It is not just one tear duct, okay? The tear gland is above your eye on the lateral side. You know your tear duct is here. If the tear duct is here, why is the tear gland there?
So your eyes can get swollen after you cry, and then just swell your eyes shut. I don't know then. The what?
The tear gland is here. The lacrimal gland is here, but the tear duct is over here.
Because the tear gland doesn't actually let tears out to the open world.
What would happen
Filter.
if this gland was here? Where would the tears go?
Down your nose.
They would come right out of the gland, right through the tear duct, down your nose. What happens if you
Wait,
dump the
you
tears
mean
over
out your
here?
nose?
They wet your eye.
Right. They get made here, they leave here. They cross your eye.
So the tears are actually from your eyeball,
The tears, it's up in here.
but it passes through the eyeball surface.
Yes, it's
So the tears that come out of my, if I'm crying, it's coming out of my eyeball.
not your eyeball.
Oh,
Your eyeball is here. This is up here.
yeah.
So it's coming from up here, it's getting dumped here, the gravity pulls it down, and it collects
Come out of
here.
the gland?
Hmm?
Come out of the gland?
Yep, they come out of the gland right there. You can see the little ducts coming out. It's gonna dump it here, and then gravity's gonna pull it down, so it'll collect here at the bottom.
This doesn't
But
do
the
anything.
but the drain That's the drain right there.
The drain.
And so if you just have a small amount of tears, it goes down the drain into your nose.
That's why you gotta blow your nose when you
Yes.
cry.
It's not snot,
It's not.
it's tears.
It's tears?
Yes.
So
Now, if you cry a lot, the tears will wash the snot out of your nose.
Okay, so how, like, when you, like, excessively cry, like, you're
God,
super
Taylor.
upset and you cannot breathe through your
Yeah,
nose
you can't breathe,
at
you
all.
get a headache.
Mouth feeling shut?
My guess, this is just a guess, is all those tears going through there cause a lot of inflammation and it all swells up.
Oh, okay.
That would be my guess.
It's so hard to breathe through your nose after you cry, like, really hard.
Yeah, and then you get like a pressure headache.
Another thing is snot is it's called a glycoprotein. It's a protein with sugar on it. And the reason it's snotty and not dry, a glycoprotein is actually dry as a powder, is it soaks up water. And so if you put a whole bunch of tears through there, all that water is going to swell up the snot. So you don't have more snot, it's just bigger and slimier. So that's going to help the plaque stuff.
When you jump into a pool and you get water in your nose, you sneeze or you cough, why don't you do that when you cry?
Because the pool water is much worse, it's much more irritating. The tears are basically just salt water, it's like saline. But if you put enough saline up your nose, that's going to cause a problem.
Yeah.
So it's made here, comes here, then we have two, what we would call the tear ducts. That's the drain. There's one here, one here. They lead to this big thing here, which is the actual duct. This is a canaliculus. There's two of them. That leads to the actual tear duct. You can't see the actual tear duct. And that dumps right there in your nose. But you also know your nose and your throat are connected. And so when you cry, you can actually get a sore throat.
Sore throat?
Yeah, because you're flushing all this stuff going on up here ends up in your throat and down here.
Did you cry too much?
They say you get a lump in your throat?
I think that's the tension, stress that causes constriction of the muscles.
It does hurt when you cry. My throat hurts when I cry.
Yeah, if I cry too much,
It hurts.
I wake up the next morning, my throat hurts.
My eyes are swollen, my throat don't hurt. I don't know how, so
So-
I cried enough.
Enough about crying.
All about your emotions.
We can have a psychology class later. We're done with emotions. This is cold, hard science. Okay. So this is our eyeball. So we said that there were 3 layers, and those 3 layers had specific parts to it. We're going to start, for the most part, on the outside and work our way in. The outermost part was the fibrous tunic, and it had 2 parts, the sclera and the cornea. The sclera is the white part of your eye. The whites of your eye is the sclera. That's going to cover the vast majority of the side of your eyeball. But we need to let light in the front of our eyeball. So we can't have a white sclera covering the front of our eyeball. And so that the tunic in the front of our eye, instead of being white, is clear, and that is the cornea. So
That's clear.
That is clear.
Whereas,
Sclera is white. You can see it comes around, and then it turns into the clear cornea, and then it turns back into the white sclera. That is the outside layer of your eyeball. Underneath that is the vascular tunic, which is primarily the choroid. The choroid is going to be a big thing. It's primarily in the back. It's this pink area here. So here we have the sclera, the white. Underneath that is the choroid. The choroid goes all the way around the back, but when it gets up to the front, it's not the choroid anymore. It's this big thing here. That is ciliary body, labeled on this side. The ciliary body looks like the end of the choroid. It is essentially the intrinsic muscles of the eye. We have extrinsic muscles on the outside, which move the eyeball. Then we have intrinsic muscles that are going to pull on the lens. And we'll talk about that, but pulling on the lens changes its shape, which changes the focus.
So like dilation.
The dilation is the pupil, which is the third and final part of the vasculature.
Okay.
So the pupil is actually the hole in the iris. And so the iris is the colored part on the front of your eyeball.
Like blue, green.
Blue, green, brown, orange, whatever.
Black.
Black, any color. It controls the size of the pupil. The pupil is just a hole. That's all the pupil is. It's just a hole in the iris. So the iris gets larger and smaller to control how much light is going through the pupil. Then we have the retina. And the retina is only in the back. So that's the yellow here, and it stops right about at the iris here.
That's why they do that picture of the eye doctor.
They look in the back of your eye at your retina. Yeah.
You can get them dilated or
Yeah, they give you the little eye drops to make your pupils stay open so
No,
they
if-
so they can see really well.
if you don't want to get them dilated, you can set up your thing and take the picture. At my eye doctor anyway.
I've only
Yeah,
had
stare at the blimp and they flash.
Yeah, you look at the little blimp at the end.
I've only ever had one eye exam in my life, so I don't. But I renewed my driver's license today, and I got the little eye test on the third and final try, and so I'm good.
So you could have been not getting a license back.
No, I would have had to drive home and get my glasses and go back. But
They probably let you drive home.
They won't. I don't care.
I still have my old license, so it hasn't expired. So. Okay, so the retina is here, it's in the back of your eye. If we follow it, it makes a sharp turn here and goes that way. It is the optic nerve. We mentioned that on Tuesday, I think. The optic nerve attaches to the brain, comes out, and then folds along the back of the eyeball and is the retina. Inside the eye, we have a couple different areas. We have the anterior and the vitreous chambers. Okay, so if I come back, the anterior chamber or the anterior cavity is in front of the lens. The lens is going to be the dividing point between the anterior and the vitreous chambers or cavities. Same thing. In front is anterior. That's easy to remember. Anterior is front. Unfortunately, in the back, it's not posterior. It's vitreous chamber. That is this whole area back here, between the lens and the retina. That's going to make up the bulk of your eyeball. It's filled with a fluid called vitreous humor, or vitreous body, same thing. So the anterior cavity has aqueous humor. The vitreous chamber has vitreous body. In front of the lens, the anterior cavity with the aqueous humor. Behind the lens is the vitreous chamber with the vitreous body.
Can you say?
Yeah.
So the anterior cavity is the same thing as the vitreous chamber.
No.
They're different.
Anterior cavity is in front of the lens. Vitreous chamber is behind the lens. Here's the lens. Everything up, the empty space up here is the anterior chamber. All the empty space back here, which you can't see because we haven't cut the eyeball open, would be the vitreous chamber.
Okay.
So I got these models out, and I forgot I got them out. So here is an eyeball that's cut open. That's the iris, with the pupil in it. The lens has been removed, but it would sit right behind the pupil here. And so the lens would be here, and so the open space around this pupil, around the iris, would be the anterior chamber. And then all this open area back here would be the vitreous chamber.
So it's about a month.
Yes, the lens is the divider between them. So here is our pupil. And so we know when you go in the bright light, it closes down. When you go in the dark light, it opens up. We want to try to allow roughly the same amount of light in at all times. We definitely can't do that. Because no matter how wide my pupil gets, if it's night out, I'm not getting much light.
So if when you're sleeping, are they mute?
I don't even know how you would do that experiment. Someone would have to sleep with their eyes open.
It's freaky.
That's awful.
I would imagine so.
Probably.
You could probably just open someone's eyes while they're sleeping and, okay, how would you see it?
But how are you going to not wake them up?
Ooh, night vision goggles. Look at their eyeballs,
Deep
night vision
sleeper.
goggles.
But their eyelids are still closed.
You used to open it.
Correct, but how do you do that without waking them up?
Oh, you can do that to me. Lord.
But, okay, so if it's bright out, we're trying to limit that brightness so that we don't damage the back of our eye. We can actually damage the back of our eye. That's what happens when you stare at the sun. All those people that looked at the eclipse without the fancy dollar glasses,
I haven't heard of any of them.
they have that eclipse burned onto the retina for the rest of their life. Okay?
So, wait,
I remember that.
I don't know if this is dumb. Does it look like an eclipse in their eyeball? Oh, I thought you meant like it literally burned the image of
They literally see.
Basically what's going to happen, it would damage that part, and so instead of being light there, it would be black.
Huh,
You'd have a black spot.
that's sad.
That would be
Oh,
annoying.
so it's like
That would be horrible.
everywhere they look.
Yeah, so I mean, if you're staring at it, it's going to be in one place, and you're probably looking right at it, and so
That would really
that
be
is going to be
annoying.
in the center of your vision, everywhere you look. Right in the center is going to be a black spot.
Did that happen to you?
Oh,
So
lots
they'll
of
probably
people.
learn to look around.
Really?
And then it'll go.
Eventually, I mean, it'll very slowly go away, but very, very slowly.
If they're dumb enough not to listen, then they just
It's hard, especially for 3-year-olds.
You got a 3-year-old grandma.
This class is
This is our retina. We're not going to go too in depth on how the retina turns light into an action potential, but here we have the outside of the retina. And then in here we have rods and cones. You've heard of rods and cones before, I'm sure. They're what actually are going to sense the light. They are cells. They are individual cells. Each rod, each cone is a cell. When a beam of light hits that cell, it creates an action potential and passes it to the dendrite of a neuron. And that creates the action potential flow that goes all the way in along the retina, up the cranial nerve, into the brain.
So if someone's born blind, are they born without rods and cones?
There are a number of reasons why they could be blind. It's probably not a lack of rods and cones, it's that they're defective.
So what happens if someone doesn't have any rods at all?
Well, we'll skip ahead a couple slides. So rods contain a protein called rhodopsin.
Okay.
Rods are black and white. In daylight, they're not working very hard. They're for the low light, black and white vision. The cones have a protein called photopsin. This is in bright light and color. So, if you had only cones and no rods, what would happen?
If you only had rods?
If you, I don't know what I said. I meant to say no rods. Only cones, no rods. 'Cause that was my question.
You'd only be able to see color.
You'd only be able to see color,
But how would you see color if you can't see?
and well, you can see.
What if it,
You'd have trouble really at nighttime.
You'd have bad night vision.
oh,
You'd have very, very bad night vision. If you had no rods, you'd have almost no night vision.
Vision goggles.
People who have just bad night vision probably have fewer rods than most other people, or they don't work quite as well.
What does non-functional in daylight mean?
Meaning, if in bright light, this would probably be considered close to daylight in here. Our cones are able to do it. The cones are better sensors. They give us a better picture of what's around us.
So rods are used at night.
Rods are used at night in low light situations.
But they can't detect color either way.
Correct. Black and white only, and they're good at detecting low light levels.
Okay.
Let's go back. So that's the rods and cones here. Obviously, we'll come back to them when we get to that slide. When the light enters our eye, it gets bent. Bending light is called refraction. That's what a prism does. A prism bends light, which is called refraction. If you use a magnifying lens, you're bending light. The lens in our eye does the same exact thing. Instead of magnifying, like a magnifying glass, the purpose of the lens in our eye is to bend the light to focus it. That allows me to look in the front, and then the back, and then over there. Every time I change the distance that I'm looking at, I'm having to refocus. Like on our microscopes, if I focus to one slide and then I move the slide up or down, it's out of focus. Then I need to refocus the microscope. If you want to look at something that is closer to you, you need to increase the curvature of the lens. Okay? The lens is basically a water balloon. It's a clear water balloon. It's normally spherical. When you pull on it, it flattens out. And so it's more curved when you're not pulling on it. When you pull on it, it flattens out. And so for close objects, you want more curved and so you don't pull on it. The further away you're looking, your lens is going to flatten out. If your refraction is not correct, you have myopia, which is nearsightedness, hyperopia, which is farsightedness, or astigmatism, which is caused by a poor shape of either the eyeball, the cornea, the front of the eyeball, or the lens. It's not spherical to begin with. And so even when you pull it, it's kind of uneven. It's more curved on one side than the other. I think on the next slide we'll see how this actually occurs.
Yeah, I have some eye shape.
Most people have at least some astigmatism.
Someone told me that recently they were like, you have astigmatism because of like growing up with technology and always looking at screens.
That I can't tell you.
They have bad eye spectrum too. Was it a real person?
But what I do know is that if you have astigmatism, your glasses and contacts cost about 3 times as much.
Yeah. Sucks.
When you look at something close to you, like when you look at the tip of your nose and you go cross-eyed and your eyes come together, that's called convergence. So the closer you're looking, the closer your object is to you, the closer your eyes, your pupils come together. They point towards each other. That's called convergence. The pupil constricting is an autonomic reflex. So we talked about that with the cat on Tuesday. If you just surprise the cat, the fight or flight mechanism kicks in and it opens wide up.
You get a cat.
Hmm?
You get a cat.
Well, I could get a cat.
Because
Is that what
you
you're
didn't
saying?
want dogs because they needed too
Ah.
much attention.
I had a cat. I don't have a cat now, but
I'm so
I had a
over
cat.
it.
The pupil constricting in response to the light brightness is also an autonomic reflex. We can't control that. We can't look at the sun and say, I do not want my pupils to get smaller. Okay, you can't control that. This is a normal eye. When the light comes in, we want to focus it, and so that all the light comes together at a single point right on the retina and the back of our eye. if we are nearsighted, our eyeball is extra long. It's longer than it should be. And so when our lens focuses it at the same place, it's focusing at the same place, but now it's not focusing it on the retina. And so the light that was coming from up here continues going down, hits the retina here. The light here hits the retina up here. It's not hitting in the same place on the retina, and so it's out of focus. For farsighted, your eyeball is too short. And so you're focusing back here. And so again, the light in different places is hitting in different locations on the retina. If you get contacts or glasses, you bend the light before it hits here. And so now, the two lenses combined focus the light right on the retina. We had the rods with the rhodopsin, cones with the photopsin. How are you going to remember which one's which?
Rhodopsin.
Yes, rods have rhodopsin. And so by default, cones have photopsin. Don't worry too much about this. If you want to learn how that signal gets from your eye, from the retina, into your brain, it's there. This is a diagram showing it. And to me, the more interesting part here is not this part coming into the brain, it's this part up here. Because actually, some of the light that hits my right eye is going to cross over and go to the left side of my brain. Some of the light hitting my left eye is going to cross over and go to the right side of my brain. So imagine this is a head. There's a light coming into this eyeball. We're going to look at the left eyeball. If we follow the lines, this one crosses, this one stays over here. This one crosses over to the right side. If there's light entering my eyeball and it's hitting here, what direction did it come from, the left or the right? Right. It came from over here, entered the eyeball, and then hit there. And so that one goes to the left side of my brain.
Why are those eyes across?
Because they're looking at something close to the person.
Okay.
What can you tell me about what side of the body is controlled by what side of the brain?
Left is controlled by the right.
Left side of the body is controlled by the right side of the brain. The left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. So the light came from the right side, and so it goes to the left side of the brain, which controls the right side of the body. So if I'm standing here, and all of a sudden, a squirrel jumps out of the ceiling at me, okay?
Some Christmas vacation.
Yes. It's coming from my right, so it's going to hit the left side of my left eyeball and go to the left side of my brain, which controls the right side of my body, and so I can swat the squirrel out of the air. Okay? If the squirrel comes from my left, it's going to hit the right side of my eye, which is going to cross over to the right side of my brain, which controls my left arm to swat the squirrel out of the air.
That makes sense.
And so it's a double crossing over. It crosses over here, but then the signal from the brain to the muscle crosses over. It's a double negative.
So your left, if I have one eye, it all goes to my left eye brain.
No. If you only have the left eye, the light coming from the right goes to the left brain. The light coming from the right goes to the right brain.
Oh, look. Okay, I see what you're saying now. So if the squirrel was coming from here,
If it's coming from your left, it's going to hit the right side of that one, which will go to the right brain, and the right side of that one, which goes to the right
but
brain.
your pointer's still up.
Hmm?
Say it again. Do it again.
He means like the right, like you see how there's two?
You see, there's a
Each
blue
eye
one
has
here and a blue
two.
one here.
He has a right on the left eye. Does that make sense?
So if squirrel's coming from the left,
Yep.
'Cause
the
I'm not
light
seeing-
is going to come into this eyeball and hit the right side of the left eyeball,
Okay.
which will go to the right brain. Then it's going to also come in and hit the right side of the right eyeball, which stays on the right to go to the right brain.
So if it's coming from here, it's going to
It's
rub
gonna-
it again.
If it's coming from the right side, it's going to hit the left side of both eyes, and both of those go to the left brain.
Oh, so it's exactly what you just said. Got it.
That's more of an interest thing rather than a textbook
Yeah.
exam question thing. But if you see a question about squirrels jumping out of ceilings, you know that I wrote it. Right? That, you don't see many of those in textbooks.
Squirrel swatting
Question, me too.
Maybe the exams are already printed. Maybe a quiz question.
Maybe
I can
we
make
do
I can give you a
exams.
quiz
I
question
mean,
about.
Put that out there.
Okay, so that's the eyeball. Then we get to the ear. And the ear is involved in two very different senses. There's hearing, but our balance also comes from our ear.
Doesn't it come with our eyeball too? That's just depth perception?
I think it helps to tell us how we're oriented, but not balanced. Because
Okay.
I mean, if we go like that, I see everything is moved, and so I know that I'm to the side.
Okay.
So, but the ear is going to be divided into three main parts: the external ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. So we've got our that way. We've got our ear here. This is the eardrum. The eardrum is the divider between the external ear and the middle ear. It itself is considered part of the external ear. Okay? Its goal is to collect all the sound waves and direct them into our skull. That's all it does.
Going through the eardrum?
So it brings it in to the eardrum, then the eardrum vibrates. Okay? So we have vibrations in the air. When they come in here, they hit the eardrum actually vibrates. Like if you've seen a bass drum and you hit it and it vibrates. The eardrum is doing the same exact thing. It's going to vibrate. Then we get the middle ear. Middle ear is pretty small. It is this little spot in here.
It's like
Wait.
a centimeter long on that thing?
Yeah. Roughly. And there's going to be a few things in here we'll learn, but there's some bones here. Their job is to take the vibrations of the eardrum and move them into the inner ear, where the actual hearing happens. Also in the middle ear is this thing. You know what that is? It's a tube.
Eschewation tube.
Eustachian tube, yes. It's the eustachian tube. Where do you know eustachian tube from?
Your brain?
No.
And does it go to your brain at all?
No.
Your throat.
It goes to your throat, yeah.
Okay.
What happens if you go up on an airplane?
Your top.
Your ears pop. Why?
Oh, that's just pressure.
Pressure change. And so this connects to your throat, which is open to the outside.
So do you burp?
You don't
No,
burp.
you
And so the middle ear is a closed environment. And so when you go up in an airplane, the
Oh.
pressure is changing here, but not here. And if you get a pressure change on one side and not the other, you get a force that's pushing
painful.
in here. Yeah.
So
And
your
so,
mouth doesn't pop because
You can,
it's to the outside world.
like,
right.
And then hold your nose.
So
Yeah.
if we're down here, if we're on the ground, we have a fairly high pressure here and also out here.
Okay.
Okay? When you go up in the airplane, the outside pressure goes down, the inside pressure stays the same. And so what happens, have you ever taken like a balloon, it's in a car and you go up in the mountains or something, it gets bigger, it expands. Your middle ear does the same thing. It pushes on your eardrum, trying to blow it up like a balloon. And so it gets painful. The eustachian tube, right in this area here, it's not on this model, has basically a little gasket. And if we get a high enough pressure change, it's supposed to pop open and release that pressure.
So
What about when you swim to the bottom of the pool?
Oh, yeah.
When you swim to the bottom of the pool, the pressure goes way, way up on the outside. And so then you're pushing all of this stuff, and you're basically creating a vacuum in your middle ear.
So what happens when it pops? You get an ear infection?
So if it pops when you're up in the, it's number one, it's supposed to pop, okay?
That's why they tell you to chew gum.
Yeah. So there's two ways to make this. There's two ways to make this pop open. It normally goes when you chew. When you chew for a split second, that's supposed to pop open and equalize the pressure. Or if you get too large of a pressure difference, it should just pop open on its own.
Underwater?
No,
Anyway, if you have a too large of a pressure difference on the sides of that gasket, it should pop open to relieve the pressure.
By pop open, you do mean pop open to the real world.
Yes.
That's why you get water in your ear? Like a swimmer's ear?
No, that's something different. So a swimmer's ear has water out here, and unless you have something wrong, a hole in your eardrum, water is not getting in here.
Even if it pops?
If you had a mouth full of water, like you were at the bottom of the pool with your mouth wide open, and it popped,
That'd be pretty dumb.
you would get water in here, but at that point I think you have bigger problems.
Yeah, you're gonna drown.
You're going to drown, and who cares if you have water in your middle ear at that point? So that's the middle ear. And then there's the inner ear, which is all this crazy stuff in there. And that's where the magic happens. That's where all,
hearing aid in the back.
it looks like one, yeah. So we'll learn about what all is going on in there. So the external ear has three parts. There is their ear, which is the auricle. You may also see the word pinna. This is the auricle and the pinna out here. Then you have the external auditory canal, which is just the canal going in your ear where you stick a Q-tip. Did we have this conversation about people sticking Q-tips where you're not supposed to?
Yes, you said definitely in your ears and Q-tips.
Yeah. And then, if you stick the Q-tips down far enough, you get the eardrum.
That's that part?
That is this thing
Okay.
right
Wait,
here.
you said to clean our ears and ears?
I don't know.
Hmm?
You said not to, never.
The instructions say you're only supposed to use the Q-tip out here.
I don't understand how you're supposed to clean your ears. That's
Aren't you
We're supposed to
supposed to
wash
warm
them out.
water and
Supposed to wash them out.
really the doctor's supposed to do it?
You want to pay to have that done, you can stick
I'm
Q-tips.
gonna put my ears up there and
The middle ear has
I'm gonna confuse them.
the eustachian tube, which is also the auditory tube. There are the auditory ossicles, which are these little bones in here. And then there's the oval window. And we'll see the oval, it's small, you can't see it on here from where you are. We'll see it on a diagram up here. The internal ear has a bony labyrinth and a membranous labyrinth. When you imagine the word labyrinth, what do you picture?
Labradoodle, a lab dog.
No, that's not what I was going for. A labyrinth is a thing.
What?
A labyrinth is a word.
Anything?
No, it's a specific thing.
Never.
It's like a maze.
That's
Okay.
not what I was
A labyrinth is a maze. It's like a maze of tunnels. So the bony labyrinth is basically a maze of tunnels in the bone in our ear. Then inside of that is a membrane, the membranous labyrinth. Then there's the cochlea. The cochlea is, I can get it out, the snail-looking part here.
That's
Okay?
a hearing aid thing.
That's the hearing aid thing. These, we'll come back to these, those are the membranous labyrinth. And for these to exist, they go through the bone. So there has to be tunnels in the bone where these live. Then there's the spiral organ, which is the very center of the snail. That is where the actual hearing happens. So here's our diagram. So here I hope you can see these little circles live up in this bone. And so for them to be there, there has to be tunnels dug through the bone. The tunnels in the bone are the bony labyrinth, and then in that is the membranous labyrinth, which make up the circles. Then we have our cochlea, and then in the very, very center of that would be the spiral organ or the organ of Corti. Zooming in on this, we can see there's a hole here. That hole is where the ossicles in the middle ear connect to this. So that the eardrum vibrates, which causes the bones in the middle ear to move, and those attach here. That is one of the ossicles here. That is the stapes. Okay? When you do that, you take like taking a plunger and going like this, because inside of the snail is water. And so you take a plunger, you go like that, you create waves of pressure inside of here. Those pressure waves go through the spiral and end up in the middle where we actually sense the vibrations. Up here, these are, I think it was labeled on the other one. The membranous labyrinth and the bony labyrinth are these semicircular canals. Those are going to be used for our balance. So this is what we talked about. Sound waves coming in, they hit the eardrum vibrates, which causes the bones in the middle ear to move. And when they move, they push and pull the plunger on the cochlea, which sends pressure waves through the spirals into the very center. We recognize the sound there, and that gets turned into an action potential, which goes to the brain. So this is the sound. These are the balance. We have two types of balance. We have static equilibrium and dynamic equilibrium. Static equilibrium tells us how we are oriented in space. It has nothing to do with movement. It's only how we are in space. Always forget brain. That worked. So the way static equilibrium works is we have a little cup. Okay? And sitting in that cup is a grain of sand. Imagine I have that cup or a bowl. If I am perfectly upright, where in that bowl is the grain of sand?
Bottom.
Right. You can't even see it, and you know it's sitting in the center, bottom of that bowl. If I tilt myself, that bowl is going to tilt. Where is that grain of sand going to go?
To the side, to the bottom still.
It moved this way. The further I go this way, the further it slides that way. If I tilt backwards, it slides this way. If I tilt that way, it goes that way. If I tilt that way, it goes that way. And so depending on where that grain of sand is sitting in that bowl, we know how our head is tilted. Every time I tilt, that grain of sand is moving in that bowl. And just monitoring where that grain of sand is tells me how I am tilted. Dynamic equilibrium tells me how I am turning. This is where we sense the G-forces. Okay? That is the semicircular canals here. The little bowl and cup is in this area here between the semicircular canals and the cochlea. Semicircular canals deal with motion. So if we're moving in this world. How many dimensions is our world?
Multi?
Yes, there's multiple dimensions, but how many?
30.
No.
1.
No.
3.
3. There's 3 dimensions. Left, right, up, down, forward, and back. So we can move in 3 dimensions. And so we have 3 semicircular canals. Each one senses movement in one of those dimensions. The fourth dimension is time, but we don't sense that with our ears. We don't sense it much at all. But it is just as much a dimension as what we sense as dimension. Then I think that's probably rare. People probably either have 3 or none. But you wouldn't be able to sense G-forces in that one direction that you were missing. So the way this one works is, imagine you have these canals and there's fluid in them. Okay? And then on the wall of the canals are little hairs. When that fluid moves, it brushes over the hairs, and the hairs know that water is moving. Instead of the water moving, the actual canal is going to move around the water. Imagine you have a hose. You just used it, it's a garden hose. It's sitting on the ground. You turn the water off, and so that there's water's not flowing out of it anymore, but you know there's going to be some water left in there, right? If I take that hose and I pull it really fast, what happens to the water? It comes out the other end, right? Because the inertia of the water makes the water want to stay where it is, and I pull the hose, and so the water moves in the hose to try to stay in one place. If the hose had little hairs, it could sense that water moving. But we're smart enough to realize it's not the water that's moving, we're moving around the water. And so if the water seems like it's moving left, that means we're moving right. If it seems like the water is moving back, that means we're moving forward.
The water in our ear,
In these semicircular canals.
our natural water? Or
Yes,
like-
it lives there.
Oh, okay.
It's always there.
That's weird. But it is touching it.
Touching what?
Like the water is touching the.
Yes. So this is the water. This is the hair sticking into here.
Why can't we hear it?
Here what? The water?
Yeah.
Because there's very little of it, and there's no way to conduct that vibration into the cochlea. So that's the end of our senses. Take a break. We will do our lab quiz at 10 after on that clock. So a little over 10 minutes. There's one question on this model. It could be, name it, it could be function. There will also be one question on this guy here, on the muscles on the face and neck. It could be name the muscle or give me the function of that muscle.
Can we do names?